I'll be curious to see if this video is in focus, because the one that I did last night, book launch soon, Song of Mornius, looked to me like it was out of focus the whole time. But you know, maybe I did that deliberately, kind of like a soft filter on the because I'm getting older and more Hague-looking, Hague-like as time goes on. Being a bus driver, I don't really fuss too much anymore. It's like I don't care. But anyway, that's not the point of my video. I was really excited when I got onto my channel, my new channel on YouTube, and I saw that I have 3 subscribers. I'm excited. It's encouraging to know people are in my corner rooting for me. It's really encouraging. I'm flattered. And I thought it would be kind of fun, because I put up a post from December 18th, 2014, where I read chapter 1 as it was on the floppy disk. That was the condition that chapter was in 2014, when I believe I officially started to get serious about recreating the book. And then I rewrote chapter 1 because I didn't like the 3 scenes. It was very clunky. I thought I would make it all into one scene with a flashback. And I thought I could be a clever enough writer to just do it so well that any editor looking at it would just overlook the fact that there was a flashback in the very first chapter of my book. Well, no, not so much. The line editor, one of her nits about the story was, you put a flashback in your first chapter. Like, what were you thinking? You know, so one of the things I had to do right away was rewrite yet again chapter 1. Chapter 1 has had 3 edits now. It's been rewritten, it's had the line editor go through, it's had the copy editor go through it twice. By the way, I highly recommend my copy editor. She is awesome. She goes above and beyond. Any writers out there, wannabe writers who are looking for a good editor, I would recommend her, and I would give you her name if you drop me a private message. Okay. So, I thought for fun, just to treat my loyal supporters, my new supporters, people who actually are rooting for me. I just think that's just so fucking cool. Anyway, I thought I would let you hear what chapter 1 sounds like now. This would be chapter 1 as it would most likely be when this publishes in a few months. Okay, and I'm going to read from this book. Don't laugh. This is that art that I was saying in my last video that was plagiarized from the picture of smog. I just think it's a cool picture. And this was like the middle stage, and I kind of like to make proofs of my book every step of the way. Well, this was one of the steps, right? So it's just a proof, but I really like this cover. I wish I could use it, but I mean, not this picture. I wouldn't want to use this picture, but I like the style with how it is on the back, and you can kind of see this image of the cover. I think that's really a cool style, but alas, it is not to be. Okay, so I'm going to read chapter 1 as it is now. And again, I'm not a reader. I have gotten better, but I'm still not really super wonderful. So, but I will give it my best shot. Okay, Song of Mornius, chapter 1. Galen stumbled back the way he had come, clutching his staff. Mornius had been his sole possession through the years. He had tucked the ancient relic beneath the moldering straw that served as his bed in the dilapidated barn, hidden from sight as his mother had urged, in the one place his stepfather avoided. Now, as Galen approached the eerie silence of the ramshackle cabin, he leaned hard on the staff's support. Outside the front window, he jerked to an awkward stop, his right hand still gripping the axe's bloody handle. With a grimace, he lowered his head and ran his jaw along the shoulder of his gray tunic, wiping off the blood he felt trickling into his beard. The salty tang of fresh meat emanating from inside the cabin overwhelmed the familiar sense of the surrounding trees. Through the crack under the door, Galen caught a faint buzzing of insects. His mouth fell open. Quickly he snatched breaths to combat his nausea as, without conscious thought, his fingers unlocked and he let the broken axe fall. A gust of wind battered the treetops beyond the little cabin, bending the blue-bark conifers to its will. Shivering in his tunic and worn black leggings, Galen lifted his staff and pushed himself away from the one building he had known other than the barn for 19 years. He broke into a shambling run down the steep grade beneath the frozen trees, blindly driving himself headlong from the scene of his crime, the site of Seth Laval's murder. Onward he fled into blue-gray shadow, cleaving bracken and rough greenberry, sobbing for breath as he raced below the reach of the midday sun. He stumbled and skidded, half falling through clove leaf, its berry clusters staining his tattered sleeves a dark blue. A tree's root stopped him, snagging the toe of his boot. With a yell he pitched forward, landing hard on his left shoulder. Galen rolled, then sat trembling with his legs spread. Through a haze of mounting fatigue he studied the trail before him, a narrow track stamped out by deer. Carefully he massaged the base of his right thumb, feeling again the axe's handle, its wood against his palm. Shivering, he raised his knees to his chest. "You were only supposed to escape," he whispered. "How could this happen? How could he know? And then—" Blue light pulsed from his staff on the frosty leaves beside him, veining out from the blue-violet gem encased by iron at Mornius's crown. Galen stared through the branches overhead, blinking at the sun's golden blur through his tears. He heard the crackle of Mornius's power crossing the leaves, felt the tendrils of its magic caressing his lower back, clearing the mist from his sight. The staff's power was familiar, yet he knew too much exposure would leave him feeling ill. Reaching out, he caught Mornius's wooden shaft and shook it once to quell its fire, feeling with satisfaction his arm muscles flex. He had worked so hard to prepare for this, to build up his body to escape Seth Laval and finally make something of himself. To run away, he groaned, not kill. Why did he have to ruin it? Why couldn't I stop myself? He was down. I could have just run. Teeth gritted, he nodded to the steep, narrow path before him. "Now I deserve to die," he muttered, eyeing the winding track that no longer promised him freedom but death. "I can't hide from this. I've killed someone." Galen bit down a sob as he struggled to rise. His staff rang hollow on the trail when he planted it, reminding him how close winter was. He lurched to his feet and again ventured downward, gravity forcing him into a trot, thrusting him recklessly through fern stalks as wide as his wrist, their frosted stems splintering as he passed. "Blue barks first, and king skies," he panted, glancing sideways at the trees as the path leveled out. "Winter whites next, those tall ones I see below. And after them comes Kitterin," Galen said. "A place with buildings in rows and streets set between them." He rubbed at his forehead as he walked, straining to recall the descriptions his eldest stepbrother Delbert had given him from a year ago, before Delbert had left for the town of Chitan to start his new job along with his bride and younger brother Jax. "There will be people," Galen said, "enforcers who—" He stopped and shrank back, pressing against the base of a tree as he stared through its branches at the sky. "What if they hurt me?" "And so they should," he snarled under his breath. "You deserve it." Ducking his head, he started again, his mind returning to the year he had spent building up his endurance. The constant chores were not enough. He had forced himself to race up the steep mountain paths, run and jump carrying armloads of wood. "She died because of me," he thought, remembering his mother. "Seth Laval killed her because of me." He lowered the staff, bracing its heel against the ground an arm's length below a rocky ledge, then crept carefully downward. Galen shook his head, brushing aside his tears as he recalled himself at 8 years old, meeting his mother for the last time behind the barn. Once again he envisioned her glistening, grief-smudged face as she placed the staff in his hands. This was Garrick's Galen. He was the father you never knew, she had whispered, stroking his head as she held him close. He was special. So are you, my baby. Your great-grandfather's father is the first who fought with this. Mornius, that's its name. I kept it hidden for you in that little cleft down in the ravine. Galen, Seth knows. I don't know how he found out, but you must hide this away. No matter what happens, never let that drunkard or his sons see it. Promise me. Galen shivered as the icy drum of rain on his face brought him back to himself and to the growing awareness of how far he had traveled. He started in fear at the misty outlines of buildings through the trees, square shapes larger than any human-made thing he had ever seen. He hunkered behind his staff as 3 rain-blurred figures appeared, striding between 2 buildings, then quickly vanished from his sight. Fear locked him in place until the chill of the rain reached toward his bones, forcing him at last into motion. Shivering hard, he ventured through mud and over a path of red stones to press his palm against the wooden back of the first building he came to. He stared at his gore-stained fingers, at his scarred wrist dripping red, and his tunic's gray sleeve marked with berry juice and blood. So much blood, he thought, glancing down. Everyone will know. Again he cringed, icy water streaming over his scalp. Slowly he crept his way around the side of the building, collapsing at the base of its checkered green and white front. The citizens of Kitterin avoided the stony path where he crouched, stomping by instead on the muddy street. They passed with their gazes averted, shielded from his plight as he huddled in the rain. To their eyes he was a vagrant, starving and off his head, reeking of old blood. Only the storm failed to shun him, the force of its rain drumming against his forehead. Leather creaked as a man appeared before him and crouched down. Galen tensed and focused on his arms, where they rested on his knees, and on the pinkish rain sluicing over his wrists. The newcomer tapped his shoulder, speaking gently. Hard times in Kitterin, aren't they? Galen flicked his gaze upward at the stranger's face, then immediately dropped his head. He studied his hands, the pale white gleam of his knuckles beneath his freckled skin. You'll freeze sitting out here. The man bent close, water trickling in rivulets from leather guards across his shoulders and arms. Why aren't you home? I don't have. Galen thumped his shoulders wetly against a building. I'm not. What's this you're covered with? As Galen watched, the stranger slipped his hand under the fabric of Galen's dripping sleeve, catching the pinkish rain in his palm. Blood, the man said, sniffing what he held. He tipped his hand and let the soiled water trickle to the stones. What happened to you? Are you hurt? I see the bruise on your face, but nothing to account for this. Trembling hard, Galen stared at his knees. He swallowed, dismayed at the sudden thickness of his tongue. Then he shook his head and forced his head up to meet the stranger's brown eyes. Seth Laval, Galen said, forced to project his voice over the slapping of the rain against the mud. I was trying to escape. He was going to kill me. The stranger frowned and leaned closer. Kill you? Seth Laval's a recluse, a bully and a drunk, but I can't imagine. He kept me on the mountain, Galen blurted. He killed my father and stole our cabin, forced my mother to live there as his wife. She let him think I was his son, but then he figured out I wasn't. He killed her and kept me alive to punish her. Leaning forward, the stranger probed Galen's shattered cheekbone beneath his drenched hair. Seth Laval did this? I'd no idea he had a stepson. Eyes closed, Galen nodded. He tried to kill me. Why? Galen shivered, numb from exposure as he was. He still felt the hungry winter closing its teeth on late fall. "I was trying to escape," said Galen, "but then he caught me, and I grabbed the first thing I could, the axe he left on the table." Fingers caught Galen's left wrist, pushing back the threadbare sleeve of his tunic. He shivered at the stranger's touch, how the man traced the many scars crisscrossing his skin. "Years," the man whispered, and Galen, embarrassed, jerked back his hand. "Please," Galen said, "I need to see the enforcers. He's dead and I killed him. I can't go back home." "We'll sort that out later," the man replied. "Get up now. You'll catch your death sitting out here." Hands firm and gentle raised Galen to his feet. He tottered, but the larger man supported and turned him. Then they stumbled, as if comrades, through the rain. The persistent rap of knuckles on wood jerked up his head. Bewildered, Galen stared through a bleary haze of exhaustion at the man seated opposite him across the little table. A man in his early 30s, he guessed, who had been kind enough to bring him in from the rain. "I said," repeated the stranger, with an air of dwindling patience, "I'm Tarek Florin, son of Lucian. My father owns Veilhorse, the ranch outside of Kitterin." "And you are?" Galen tightened his grip on the upright staff beside him as he met his companion's gaze. His weary mind reeled, snatching him from the present and showing him once more what he had done, how his stepfather had tried to run after throwing the chair, and how the axe Galen carried seemed to have had a mind of its own. Seth Laval had toppled onto his stomach, and screaming, had dragged himself through a widening swath of blood. Galen remembered how he had stood over the dying man, his arms mindlessly rising and falling, remembered the blood warming his face and the splintering sounds in his ears. "You are?" the stranger opposite him repeated. Galen forced his gaze to focus on the other's bearded face. "Laval," he said. Galen, he added, frowning. After years of being called Runt or It, his real name lived far away in another time. Furtively he glanced at the steaming bowl before him, his stomach twisting into knots as he leaned back, staring despondently into his lap. He studied the bruise on the hand he held out of sight beneath the table, feeling again in his memory the axe's splintered handle, the weight of its head adding momentum to his strokes, the slight fleshy resistance when it struck. With a shudder he raised his head, blinking to clear his sight. In the tavern's amber light, his companion's eyes were hazel, he realized, not brown, and filled with motes of fire, a fierce determination belying his kindness. Around their little table large men pressed close. Galen shuddered at the pungent scents they brought with them, of Roy, a beverage of barley yeast and shamara flowers, or worse, the fermented potato brew preferred by his stepfather. Despite himself, Galen cringed, tilted his staff closer, and pressed it to his chest. "I had a friend near Kitterin," his companion said, eyeing him, "who owned a gracken he'd raised from a cub. He gave it love, kept it gentle, but after his death, his younger brother, Alandari, took charge. You've heard the story, Galen? You know it?" Galen shook his head. He did not want to know. More men crowded the tavern. Trembling, he fixed his gaze on the kind stranger opposite him. "No, he has a name," Galen chided himself. "Tarek Florin." And now Galen read anger in his companion's gold-flecked eyes. "The gracken thinned down into a walking skeleton," said Tarek, "neglected and starved. Matar's brother had a cruel streak and liked to hear it howl, until one day the beast ripped out Alandari's throat. I know because my brother Cameron found him torn to pieces in their barn. The sight of it?" Tarek glared, his eyes brimming at his hands. "My only brother is dear to me. The sight of that death took the life right out of Cameron. For a time he lost himself, and I had to be there for him, to help him battle his sadness for many a ninth day." Galen stared at the cloth beside his bowl, tinged with blood from his hands, reminders of Seth Laval. Beside it steamed the stew he could not bring himself to eat. Was the beast destroyed? He asked, raising his voice over the tavern's din. Tarek grimaced, as if realizing the point of his tale had gone astray. Galen lowered his spoon, rotated it slowly in his stew. "Eat up," said Tarek, reaching to tap Galen's fingers holding the utensil. "We need to talk." Galen studied his food while the older man ate, letting his mind wander. With a practiced shake, he dropped his rust-colored hair over his eyes. Numbly, he glanced out the window at the twilight behind the rain. Tarek, he thought, looking again at the man across the table. Nervously, he glanced around him at the noisy tavern. Did Seth Laval come here? He wondered. How many of these people knew him? As Tarek set aside his spoon, Galen peered again at him from under his matted hair. "I can't eat until I get it over with," he admitted finally. "I need to confess. Please help me. I can't live with this on my head. The enforcers would listen to you." Tarek frowned at his hands and wiped them slowly with his cloth. "Am I to understand you're asking to die?" Galen looked at the untouched bowl before him and nodded. "Well, forget it," Tarek snapped. "There's more to this story, Galen Laval. You don't look like a killer to me." Leaning his weight against the creaky back of his chair, Tarek eyed Galen. "If you were stronger, I'd recruit you, too," he mused aloud. "I need warriors, criminals or not. You have no home and nowhere to go. I'd take you on, but for your safety I can't let myself—" "That's fine," Galen interjected, glancing up his staff's wooden shaft to its crown of talons above his head. "I don't want to be a burden." "Let me finish." Tarek reached across the table, and Galen stiffened as the larger man brushed aside his tangled hair. "You're no warrior," Tarek said, studying him, "and I'm headed to battle against things you don't want to see. Magic-warped humans we call Dax. They're muscle and toughened skin, strong and hard to kill. Some have wings. All have poisonous spines. The cult that makes them? Erebos' slavers?" Tarek shook his head. "No, I'd only endanger you more. My father has charged me with protecting Kitterin as well as Vale Horse. I will not cause the deaths of unskilled men." "I'm strong enough," Galen said, "and I could learn to fight." Anxiously, Galen fingered his staff. "You could have me care for your animals until I do." "You're what, 14? You've hardly any beard." 19, said Galen with a toss of his head. "I'm 19. Well, you've been imprisoned on that mountain. Look at you, scared, just sitting there. Have you never seen people?" Trembling, Galen stared into the other's eyes. "No," he admitted. "I've never seen anyone." Gravely, Tarek stared back. "It's no surprise, then, that you seem younger than your years, and this leads me back to my problem. I've aided you with food, or I will if you ever eat it. So what, I just leave you here homeless, out in the cold? Which, come to think of it, why didn't you freeze to death coming down that mountain? And you did it in one day?" Galen glanced again at his staff, and the blue stone at its crown flickered in response. Across the table, Tarek inhaled sharply, blinking at the gem's sudden radiance. Reaching out, he looked to Galen for permission, then reverently touched the relic's wooden shaft. "This is old," Tarek said. "Familiar, too. I know this." Gently, he tilted it toward him to examine the rounded gem within its iron cage. "I studied artifacts from Earth in one of my classes at university. There are many—" He shook his head. "If you travel any distance, Galen, you will find that there are even whole buildings from Earth strewn across this world. Little things like stones are less familiar, but the elves would know this. It is yours?" "It's an heirloom," Galen told him. "My father gave it to my mother before he died. Seth Laval wanted their cabin, so he slit my father's throat while he slept. My mother let him think—" Galen sighed. Before she died, my mother told me that my great-grandfather's father fought with this staff. She didn't tell me how, just that he was the first who did. Sometimes the staff helps me too. I can't really explain. But today I got here by myself, he added fiercely. I'm stronger than I look. It has a name. Do you know it? Tarek asked. If I'm not mistaken, this is Mornius you hold, and that gem is the Sky Stone, a relic from Earth. It contains... I didn't know the stone had a name, too. Galen blinked, seeing the sudden intensity on Tarek's face, the flick of his eyes in warning. The older man stared past him and up, his eyes going hard. Then Galen heard it, the creak of the floorboards beneath him. He sensed the presence of someone large close behind, looming over his head. You're the one with the army, right? At the man's voice, loud and slurred from too much ale, Galen cringed. For one wild moment he feared Seth Laval had reassembled himself and followed him from the bloody cabin. Not an army, Tarek corrected, leaning back in his chair and glaring up. A company of men trying to defend my father's ranch, as well as Kitterin and you. So your father gave you a job, the big man snarled. How nice. Did he give you those fancy titles too, Commander? Tarek nodded. As a matter of fact, he did. He thought young men should. You talked my brother into joining you, and he's dead now, isn't he? Why else wouldn't he return? With a slight shake of his head, Tarek motioned Galen to stay still. Then, standing, he thrust back his chair. Your brother had a mind of his own, Lars. Faye and Brodo wanted to fight. Death is coming for Kitterin, and he wanted to stop it. Death's coming, you say? Hands clenched, the big man leaned into Galen's peripheral vision, and Galen shivered at the naked fury on his face. The man barked a laugh. Death for Kitterin. Is that the lie you tell? Is that what you're telling this infant here? Death, or worse, said Tarek, glaring. People don't just get killed, you know. They're changed into Dax, or Bodaks as we once called them. Ever see one, Lars? I have. During my stay at university, I saw paintings of creatures, monsters from Earth called demons. That's just what the Dax look like. Is that how Phaon died? The man returned. Fighting monsters for you? You think your little band can stop them? You just destroy good men, as you destroyed my brother. What's your count up to now, lordling? 50? 60 men against what? Thousands? 102 last time I checked. Tarek paused and softened his voice. I'm sorry about your brother, but he died defending his home. We fight this thing, Lars, my volunteers and the men my father hired, which is more than you do sitting on your ass waiting to die. If people like you weren't so... Fight? With ignorant children? Galen blinked as a second man launched himself at Tarek's back. Larger than the first, he had circled stealthily around while Lars spoke. As Tarek fell under his attacker's fists, the bar's patrons surged to their feet. From a shadowed niche beside the bar, 4 men leaped to Tarek's aid. Clad in garments stained with travel, they charged into the battle with their fists flailing and knives drawn. Heart pounding, Galen bolted from his chair. Sounds of combat filled the little room, driving him cowering into a corner. Tarek, panting hard, clambered to his feet. He threw a jab at the largest man, then stiffened as Lars Brodel caught him from behind, hooking an arm around his neck. Holding him fast, Brodel drew his sword, bent Tarek backward, and then with deliberate slowness slid the blade through Tarek's back and stomach. 2 men sprang to Tarek's defense, hammering the wide shoulders of his attacker. Ignoring them, Brodel adjusted his stance to support Tarek's weight while he viciously twisted the blade. With a gasp of pain, Tarek slid to the floor. Galen stared at the red pool spreading around Tarek. His staff trembled in his hand, its blue fire flaring brightly. As if from a distance he watched himself dart across the wooden floor, then crawl beneath the shifting knot of bodies. Clutching his staff, his hands still stained with murder, he crouched by Tarek. On his hands and knees he clung to the floor, the whole room spinning fast, the voices of the men above him muted, their movements slowed. Far in the distance he heard a fathomless voice command him as pressure mounted in his chest, threatening to tear him apart. Desperate for breath, Galen seized Tarek's forearm, hauling at the armored man's dead weight with all the strength he could muster from his one free hand. "Hang on!" Galen yelled. Muscles burned over his bruised ribs, pained him deeply in his left shoulder as he heaved backward out the doorway, dragging the wounded Tarek into the freezing rain. Then he knelt. "You're filth, you know that?" came Seth Laval's voice from his past. "Worthless! Why I ever let you live this long, I have no—" Galen hammered his fist against the red stones beside Tarek, pounding until his fingernails bit into his palm. He shuddered as the pain cleared his head, then bent over the wounded man. "You listened," Galen told him. "You tried to help." As he gripped Mornius, the agony in his chest shifted to his arm and then to his fingers, forcing his hand downward, bringing the weight of the skystone to bear against the gushing wound. Fire screamed from the staff, blasting silver from the stone. Eyes closed, Galen threw back his head, his writhing body gripped by a power from his childhood dreams. Darkness came to him. He sensed himself falling. Dimly he felt the shock of his shoulders striking the stony path. He managed a breath, then two. Powerful hands shook him, then an arm slid under his shoulders, lifting him into a seated position. In a daze, Galen blinked at the figure's blurry face. "I deserve to die," Galen murmured. "After you saved my life? I think not." Galen started as he recognized Tarek supporting his back. "You're alive? What did I do?" "For now I am," said Tarek. "And you're a healer, I see. Well, now I know." "Know what?" Reaching out, Galen searched the wet stones and mud for his staff. Tarek chuckled. "What you can do for my men,